I had to get out alone and figure it out on my own. And I know what I really want now. Can't stop me, can't break me. But don't kill me, don't make me. Shoot for the stars, no safety. And now I see clear in HD. Gotta go hard, gotta go hard. I ain't got time to waste. I ain't got time. I gotta go high, gotta go high. I gotta elevate, I gotta elevate. They wanna fight, they wanna fight. I'm just gonna let them hate. I'm just gonna let them hate. I gotta go high, gotta go high. I gotta elevate, I gotta elevate. You gotta choose a side. You gotta choose a side. You gotta pick. You gotta do what's right. Or you gonna lose the fight. You gotta go. You gotta choose a side. You gotta choose a side. You gotta pick. You gotta do what's right.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see all you guys on this beautiful day. I'm supposed to do a bike and running race with our kids, rain or shine, so that'd be fun. Anyway, if you are new here, my name is John Wagler, and I'm a part of this team here at Hill City, and so thankful that you decided to be here today. I know it's tough when it's raining and everything, but so thankful that you guys had some grit and got here this morning. So we're in week number 6 of this series called Take the Stairs, which comes with this main idea that we've been woven in through each week, which is simply this, that there's no elevator to success. You need to take the stairs. And we want the easy way. We want the escalator or the elevator. We don't want to put forth the effort. But the reality is if you want to be healthy emotionally, spiritually, relationally, and physically, you got to do the work. You got to do the work. You got to let God transform your heart, and then you got to do your part in it. And it's a grind, and it's going to take time. And there are things that try and interrupt us from getting healthy. And so we've been taking a look at some of those interrupters over these first few weeks. We've taken a look at a lack of discipline. We've talked about negativity, a lack of mission in your life. We talked about figuring out what season that you're in. We've talked about complaining. And today I want to talk about something that every single person in this room deals with, no matter how young or how old. I want to talk about something that is always at work inside of you and with other people that you're interacting with. And so, and it kind of stems off of this phrase that maybe you felt before. Shame on you. How many of you guys have said that to somebody else? Honestly. There's no shame here. Like, just say it, right? You said it to someone else. And in that moment when you said it, you might not have felt that you were doing this, but there was a kind of demonstrative, maybe even slightly superiority complex you had in that moment that you said it. And you wanted to kind of cut somebody else down, like, shame on you, right? When I think about it, the first thing that comes to my mind is my second grade principal. I went to a small private Christian school up through second grade, and you could still paddle at that age. You might think that's crazy, but that's what it was back then. And I just remember him getting brought into his office. His name was Principal Coletta, and he was mean as a snake, and at least I think that's how I picture him. He might have been a nice guy, but how I picture him is super mean. And so, but I just remember coming into his office. I don't even remember what I did, but I just remember him going, "Shame on you, John," and that's like stuck with me. And then he paddled me a couple of times, but then it's stuck with me. So you might have this when you hear the idea of shame. There's this kind of wide spectrum of how shame works, right? There's shame and guilt kind of can be cousins of each other. They can relate in the beginning stages of shame. Guilt might be the same kind of wording some people might use, where some of it might actually be good, like a good, healthy amount of like guilt. Like, that's the idea when he said, shame on you for doing that. What are you trying to do to somebody else? You're trying to say, hey, don't be that person. You're better than that, right? And you might have those little moments where you might have like, a little bit of guilt actually is a good thing because it forces me not to be this way. But then if it doesn't just sit there and your heart's not transformed in it, what eventually happens is it works into shame will shape your identity. And so there's a spectrum with everything that we've got to deal with shame. But the problem is we don't want to. We don't want to. We would rather hide our shame. We would rather just kind of just go about our lives. We would rather push away everything that can hinder us in this. And so what I want to take a look at here today is in this passage in John chapter 9 where Jesus is talking to his disciples and they approach this blind man. And I want to take a look at this story because there's so much shame woven into this story. But before we get there, I want to give you a little context. Because if you've ever opened up your Bible to read it, everything was based off of a shame and honor culture. Okay, so it's important when you're reading the Bible to understand that because it helps you contextualize some of the things that we see and maybe get a little deeper meaning out of it. So I want to put up there a few different things about shame and honor culture that could be helpful for you guys as we encounter this story. And the first thing is this: in the shame and honor culture, family is everything. All right, again, we don't, as Americans and as Westerners, we live in a very individualistic culture. You might have little pockets where family is everything, and it might be just like the nuclear family, like just the close. But you don't have. It's rare to come upon the family where it's like the cousins, the uncles, the aunts, like everyone's like all in on this. Like that family is everything. When someone in somebody's family back then was shamed, the whole community felt it. When someone was honored, the whole community felt honored. So shame and honor was this big thing back then, and it's a little different for us now. The second thing is that social capital is a really big deal. So your ability to interact and be in community with people around you that may not agree with you, or you come from different perspectives or whatever, the social capital you had with people to network was a really big deal. The third thing is that you never, ever insulted someone's honor. You never insulted someone's honor. And so you might see it this way. If a man abused a woman in someone's family, the end result would be the woman's family would be aggressive and typically violent in restoring their honor because it made the men of that family look weak. Not even necessarily for the harm that it caused the woman, though sometimes that was the case. But back then it was about the men looked weak. It was the shame on the family and the community. And so they were aggressive in trying to restore that honor. It's the same kind of premise. Part of the reason, like even now, why ISIS grew so much, this is part of the reason, was because of international shame. And so they were trying to restore the honor, and they do it through what? Violence and aggression. So it's part of the reason. So this idea of an honor-shame culture is a really big deal. The fourth thing is that words create social hierarchy. So you would address elders differently than you would younger people. You would address people in positions of authority different than someone who isn't. So words created the social hierarchy. So that's why when we look at Scripture and we hear things like, you'll hear in this passage that they called Jesus rabbi. It was significant because it elevated Jesus to a level, and in same level as the Pharisees, who were the religious teachers of the law back then. So the words really matter. And the last one is this, that hospitality emphasizes the gift of life. This is why you might have experienced this before, but if you go into some other cultures and say you travel across seas, like in the Middle East, or it actually really doesn't matter. Typically, international travel leads you into a time where if you're in someone's family, it's like a big spread for a meal, and like they want you to stay with them, and it's like 4 hours long, and all the things, right? All the things that they're super fun to be around, but hospitality like emphasizes this gift of life. And so I want you to see all that as we kind of enter into this passage in John chapter 9 that was written by this guy who was a very close follower of Jesus. He was with him in the beginning and then became one of the pillars of the church as Christianity began to expand after Jesus had died and risen again. And he writes this letter to detail out this story. He says this in verse 1. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, all right, so there's that phrasing, Rabbi, they're elevating him there. His disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. And so I want to hit pause here for a second because here was the perspective. This goes into the honor and shame culture. Back then, if someone was born blind or if they were missing an arm or a leg or they were paralyzed or something, and they would be ousted from the community with shame. And the family would feel that shame. And so they would do so because it was determined that the reason someone was sick and the reason someone had that was because of unconfessed or unrepented sin. Okay, and so they would think that was the way. So it must have been either the parents that didn't repent of their sins, or they were currently committing some kind of sin, or the child themselves had done some kind of sin that resulted in this sickness, disease, or disability. Sometimes people try and bring that into play currently, and Jesus speaks into that, right? Like it's not because of the sin. It's not because of their perspective is off, and it has to do with like shame and some other things around that. And so Jesus steps in, he's like, no. This isn't how this works. The story's bigger than this. I need you to see the power of God in this moment. And I want you to see this a little differently. And it's going to shift how you view shame and shift how you view people's sickness and everything. And so he bends down And he gets into the dirt and he spits in it and he puts together, makes a little mud, and then he puts the mud on the man's eyes. And instantly this man can now see. Now the community goes wild because they only knew him one way. They were like, wait, isn't that the Wilson's kid? Like those sinners over there? Like now he was blind, like now he can see? What? This is crazy. And they can't figure it out and they're wondering what's going on, and they think to themselves, well, let's go to the Pharisees because they're the teachers of the law and all these things and they know some stuff, so maybe they can explain why this dude who for his whole life and all we've known is he can't see and has been put in shame and dishonored his family and everything, why he can now see. Like, what's the deal? And so they go to the Pharisees, and here's what they say. The Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God, for he's working on the Sabbath. And others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was this deep division of opinion among them. And I want to pause there, because some of you guys who grew up in church only see the Pharisees one way. We see them as like these mean people who just hated God. But the reality is there was division there. Like some of them were like, there's something here with this Jesus. There's something here. And so we see this division that's happening around them. The Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? And so the man replies, I think he must be a prophet. And so the Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see. And so they called his parents. They asked him, think about how crazy that is. Like this guy's like, no, I couldn't see, but now I can. They're like, I don't believe you. Where are your parents? Right? Like, so you see how like crazy this kind is. And so they asked them, is this your son? Was he born blind? And if so, how can he now see? His parents replied, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him, he's old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. Understand this, the Jewish leaders who were the religious leaders of that time and of that community were shaming people in such a way to say, like, hey, if you're going to believe in Jesus, we're going to shame you in such a way that you are not welcome in our community. All right, so that's crazy. He says, so that's why I said he's old enough to ask him. So for the second time, they called him the man who'd been blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus is a sinner. I don't know whether he is a sinner, the man replied, but I know this. I was blind and now I can see. And they're like, yeah, but what did he do? How did he heal you? He goes, look, I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And so they cursed him. You are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. Why, that's very strange, the man replies. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? And so they threw him out of the synagogue, right? Shame on you. And so what I don't want us to do when it comes to shame is to think that there's this checklist, right? If I just do these 4 little things and then here's what will happen. I'll get rid of my shame and everything will be good and I can go on my merry way. Shame is something that requires transformation. It requires transformation within us. And only God can do that. But I do think there's some things that we've become aware of around shame that are really important. And I want to highlight a few of those things. Then in each thing, I want to give you just a personal story about how shame has worked in my life. And hopefully it'll resonate with some of you guys here this morning. So here's the first thing I want us to focus on. And that shame will want to pass the blame. This is the first thing. Shame will want to pass the blame. You see what the disciples do in the beginning? They said, it must be his fault. So the shame is built in, so it must be his fault. I'm going to blame the man or blame his parents for this situation that he's in. Why do they do that? Because there's this shameful atmosphere around this blind man. The parents felt the shame of the religious leaders because they were scared of it, but also were still kind of ashamed of him because now here's their son who can now see, but they feel like this weird tension of shame there. Like, well, what does this mean? That like your sins are forgiven or maybe mine aren't? And so they feel like, that's why they're like, ask him. He's old enough to fend for himself. And so there's still like a little shame there. The Pharisees are experiencing a lot of shame because why? Jesus is entering into this And he's speaking life to people, and they were once the holders of all the religious thought, and all of a sudden Jesus comes. So they feel this shame going back and forth there with Jesus, and they're blaming him for everything, and they're calling him essentially demonic. And so this is important because we see how instantaneously when shame is there, you'll blame somebody else for the shame. You know, for me, I was thinking about this, and some of you guys have heard me share a part of this story before, but when Lacey and I, we've been married for about 10 years, and we were at the Easter parade on Monument Avenue after church one Sunday, and we went out there, and we're just hanging out, and an old girlfriend walked by. And in that moment, I felt an incredible amount of shame. And not that I hadn't shared these things with Lacey, she knew everything, and actually had met this person before, and so it wasn't like this foreign thing that was happening right here in front of us, but I felt all the shame for how I used to live my life and some of the decisions I made with this girl and everything, and as she's walking towards us and she stops and says hi, and I just immediately felt like, almost like this whisper, like it was like, you're still that guy. This is who you are. Now, I had like some incredible moments with God. I'm in ministry at this point, and our marriage is great. We have 2 kids now at this point. Like, everything's going really well, and still just had this feeling of shame. I immediately turned to Lacey, and as we're walking along, I'm telling her about it and how I'm feeling about it and everything else. But it was interesting because I started to process even up through that point of my life. And I started to realize how often that shame that I was feeling because some of the decisions that I had made basically from 13, 14 years 3 years old on in my life when I was away from Jesus, I would blame other people for the decisions that I made. So I would blame the church I grew up in because it was a little crazy and a little legalistic. That's how I saw it, right? Later on, there was a lot of good things that happened too, but this is just how this is my perspective. I started blaming them. It was like so legalistic, and it was because like they didn't teach grace and forgiveness in a way that was resonating with me, and so because of that, I didn't want anything to do with Jesus, and so I made the decisions I made. Or maybe I'd blame my parents for being so strict. My curfew as a senior in high school was typically 10 o'clock at night, and I'm like, I didn't drink, I didn't do anything. Well, I did stuff, but I didn't drink. And I was like, I just wanted to hang out with my friends. And so I was like, my parents were so strict. And now I'm just like, I'm in college, I'm doing my own thing, I'm blaming them because now I'm free. Or maybe you kind of think about it, that my oldest brother, his friends that came when I was 8 years old and thought it'd be funny to show me the Playboy channel. And that led me down a pathway of losing my virginity when I was 14 years old and making all these decisions that I shouldn't have made with women, and it was their fault. And I was blaming everybody else. Now, were some of those things that I just mentioned and other things in my life, were they factors in some decisions that I made? Sure. They impact you, and they send you in a direction. All those things, they can. But at some point, I needed to take responsibility for my own actions and stop blaming other people. At some point, I just had to simply say, I'm doing this because I'm choosing to do this. I'm not putting in the work to get healthier. I'm not putting in the work to see my life differently. I'm not putting in the work, and I just would take on the shame of all those things, but I would just blame other people about it. I didn't like where I was, but then I would blame everybody else for it. And so you had to do the work. Now, am I belittling anyone's life scenario here? Absolutely not. Sometimes we go through incredibly difficult circumstances, whether it's abuse or sickness or rape or a divorce or some awful things, or you lose your job and everything gets taken away, like some awful, awful things. And we feel shame for all those things. We feel the way it's like shaped our lives, and we can blame those things for a season. And they obviously have impact. But at some point in time, we've got to stop blaming other people. This is why I love the Bible. It is woven within the context of the Bible is this idea of lament and suffering and pain and difficult circumstances and going through the worst of the worst and feeling all the feelings and all of those things and all the emotions, everything. But then there's also this part of hey, personal responsibility, grit and courage and being an overcomer, all these things like that are labeled as having resiliency. They're all together. They're all together. And we see even the message of Jesus is what? that there was shame and there was sin and all these things, but Jesus was more powerful than all of those things. And so it's all woven together, even in the story of Jesus. So at some point, we've got to start asking ourselves, am I just blaming everybody for everything? Am I allowing the shame of maybe some of the decisions that I've made? Am I tossing the blame on somebody else while not accepting the personal responsibility of it? Second thing is that shame will keep you away from truth. Shame will keep you away from truth. This is exactly what was happening with the entire community, with the disciples, and obviously with the Pharisees as well. Shame will kind of move you away from the truth that is available to you. You'll hear, like, look at the Pharisees, right? Like, Jesus is someone who's doing these works of God. There's miracles they can see, and they're teaching in a way that they never heard before, but they didn't want to believe. They were shameful. They felt shame that they weren't the most important people anymore. They felt this shame that their authority was being called into question. They felt this shame that they didn't know as much as Jesus, and they couldn't do the things that Jesus was doing. And the end result was they moved away from the truth of who Jesus was. They felt the shame, and I think this can easily happen to us. For me, Lisa and I have been married for about a year. Again, I had my kind of come back to Jesus moment, or maybe, I don't know if it was my first real moment, whatever, but at around 23 years old, I just really came back to Christ and had this transformational experience in my life. Lisa and I get married, and so by this point, I'm like 25, and we go to the first wedding of one of my friends that I played baseball with in college, and so here's what was crazy about this point. Reception starts happening, and this is the first time we've ever been together, and so me and my college friends, we went after it. And so this is the first time we've been together in this setting, and it was crazy how instantaneously we were just back to who we were. I mean, it was like instant. Everyone kind of fell into their normal roles of our friendships and everything, and so we just went after it and drank, and I got super drunk that night, and I mean, to the point where Lacey always kind of mocks me for this point, but like a few of us are like dancing, you know the song It's Raining Men? Like, this is how bad the reception got. We're like dancing in the middle of all of this. Well, anyway, so it was just an awful, awful time. So we get done, and I wake up the next morning, and I felt so much shame for what had just happened. I couldn't like process it, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like it's just like what I used to be like and all this other stuff. And I'm like, supposed to be past all this. And it took me a few days to get there, okay? Maybe longer than a few days. But like it took me a little while, a short time to get there. But here's what I had to come to grips with. Here was the truth that I was kind of ignoring. I was not as far along as I thought I was. And in that moment, that was clear evidence that I wasn't. I wasn't as far along as I thought. Now for you, it might not be about drinking. No, it might be. It might be a decision you make sexually. It might be words that come out of your mouth. It might be the way you spend your money. It might be, like you just might not be as far along as you think you are. But you have to come to grips with it. But here's what I was doing. I was denying a lot of those things in my life. I just kept denying that the power that shame had on me, that I kept denying the truth was that I was not as far along as I had hoped. You know, when we deny, here's what happens. We will empower sin. We will empower shame. And we see this even as evidence in one of the more famous stories in the Bible that most people have heard about with Adam and Eve. You hear the story about when sin comes into the world, they were what? They were naked and ashamed. And what did they do? If you guys know the story, what did they do? They hid. And what we see in that moment is that the truth was, and the power of shame was in that moment was that shame gave power to that decision to go away from what God had told them to do. You see, had they just confessed, had they been vulnerable, what would have happened? They wouldn't have been ashamed. They would have been out in the open, and they just would have said, here's what we did, our bad. But what did they do? They hid away. And God had to come in with his grace and enter into the conversation with them. You know, James, who was the brother of Jesus, he wrote a little letter to the early church. And in his letter, he says this. He says, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that, this is crazy, so that you may be healed. So here's what he's saying. If you do not confess and be vulnerable to the sins and the shame that you have inside, that you keep hidden, if you do not confess them to your community and to your trusted people, guess what won't happen? You will not be healed. Why? Because you'll keep it hidden. It'll continue to grow inside of you. It'll continue to push you away from where you would want to go. And it just eats away at you, empowers all of these things in your life that are truly terrible things. We're supposed to be people who are vulnerable and transparent and in community with people so that we can confess these things to each other, so that we can be healed. Well, why does it work that way? Well, that's what God works in community together. Now, clearly God does the transforming in us. But for some reason, God makes it happen within the context of community. I believe, this is probably the reason why Christianity as a whole has been struggling so much in our culture. It's because we've done such a great job of shaming people that the truth of Jesus has become repulsive. We've done such a great job. Someone makes a mistake or is like living their life a certain way or whatever, and they come into church and it's, how dare you, shame on you. And some of you in this room have felt that in your life. And so even the beauty and the hope and the grace and the forgiveness of Jesus becomes repulsive to people because of the way that Christians have typically shamed others. And so we even see it. So even when you kind of start processing this idea of confessing to what's really going on, maybe your focus on other people's faults may be there because you can't deal with your own. Maybe you feel the shame of some of those things, and so you'd rather focus on other people's faults than your own. Maybe you're overprotective parenting. An extreme focus on safety has to do with unresolved issues that you have. Maybe your desire for isolation and loneliness isn't because you're an introvert. Maybe you're no shame, and some of you guys might be these people or know these people, right? They have no shame over anything. They'll publicly say it, they love it, they'll say things like, hey, no shame in my game, right? Like no shame in anything I do. But maybe your no shame in anything you do has a lot to do with hardness of your heart and lack of emotional maturity and a selfish desire to always be the center of attention. Or maybe your lack of generosity is from an image-driven lifestyle. Maybe some of the things that you're ashamed of are really keeping you away from the truth of who you are because you're just hiding it in and you're not confessing it to people around you. Here's the third and last part. Shame will eventually try to redefine you. So there's these stages of shame. Eventually, it's going to try and take your identity. That's what this blind man, that was his identity. He was the blind sinner. Like that's who he was. It required the truth of Jesus to come into this, the power of God to come into this, to overcome the shame, to switch his whole identity and to see him very differently. You know, one story around this for me is, and it's something that I've had to deal with. I didn't start dealing with it honestly until I'm 42 now, but in my mid-30s is when I started to deal with this. But my biological dad, who I have 4 memories of, basically, he left early on in my life, and then and I had this one moment. His name was Dan. I was adopted when I was 12. My dad, who I call my dad now, he had been in my life since I was like 9 or 10, and he came in. He's great. My mom's great. Everything. I had this moment with my biological dad, Dan, outside the courtroom after the adoption proceedings, and I'll never forget this. He steps outside. I was not in there. He steps outside the room as he's walking out, and he grabs me by my shoulders first, and then he kind of puts his hands around my neck, and he goes, "I'll always love you." And then he walks away and never saw him again, never heard from him again, anything like that. And for years, I would almost wear it as a badge of honor that it never fazed me. That moment never fazed me, that it made me tougher, it made me deal with life better. When things happened that were maybe difficult in my life, I had this mechanism. I could just disconnect like that, not a big deal. I could just move on. And through learning more about myself and just learning and growing as a person and I think, the work of the Spirit in my life that God was doing, I started realizing the larger impact that did have on me. Again, my parents were great, and they did a wonderful job, and this is not a shot on them at all. It's just a reality that with your biological parent, you have a connection. There's nothing you can get around that. He was part of the reason I was in this world. And so Lacey would ask me, do you ever want to go say anything to him? Do you ever want to do anything to I don't know, find him or anything now that you're older and all this stuff? And I always just say no, for multiple reasons. No, because I had no emotion towards him or feelings towards him. No, because I didn't want to disrespect my parents in any kind of way. But here's what I started to realize, that moment actually shaped me in an odd way. I started realizing that my ability to disconnect relationally had nothing to do with having a lot of grit and understanding my emotions super well. It had everything to do with me actually being emotionally immature. And that it was in that moment of really wondering, if my dad doesn't love me, then who could? If my own biological dad is willing to walk out, then where am I going to find value? And it shaped parts of me, so I started trying to find it in different ways of my life. And it transferred. How I looked at God, honestly, was part of that moment. I had a tough time connecting with God because of that moment. Now the beauty of my story is great parents and there's redemptive natures to all those things. All those things, those are great. But I just have to be aware of, in the moment of feeling that shame, it shaped part of my identity. And to learn how to wrestle with that. And so you go through all of these moments of trying to figure it out. And then Lacey, I don't remember how many years ago it was at this point, but she asked me one day, she goes, what do you want to do? And I said, you know what I want to do? I just want to forgive and give grace. That's it. And I said this, and I said, I want to forgive and give grace to Dan, not because he earned it, but because my heart and soul deserved it. And then here's the other thing I needed to do. I needed to give grace and forgiveness to myself for my immaturity emotionally and all those things. And listen, I understand this is, a lot of times, men wear this as a badge of honor, our emotional immaturity. Again, that is an emotionally immature decision, okay, for all the men. But I had to forgive and give grace to myself, not because I've earned it, but because Jesus gave me an option to. And it boils down to this question, I think it did for me then, and it does for all of us here in the room today, is this: do I believe grace and forgiveness or shame has more power? If I believe grace and forgiveness has more power, then I'm going to invest in that. I'm going to take the steps in that. I'm going to do the hard work in that. I'm going to dig into what can be awful past of that and allow grace and forgiveness to speak into it. Why is that grace and forgiveness there? Only because of Jesus. Not because how smart or how disciplined or how positive I may be. Only because of Jesus. Only because the message is that Jesus got up on the cross, which was the symbol of shame, the way that the Roman government shamed everybody, that Jesus got up on the cross, took on all of the shame, died, and it's as if shame had won, and then resurrected to proclaim again, shame has no power over me anymore. So I can confess. I can be vulnerable. I can let people know. I can embrace forgiveness and grace. I can be resilient. I can have courage. I can have grit. I can be an overcomer because of Jesus. I stopped, and you got to stop thinking of your life through this lens of letting anyone else shape your identity but Christ. That is the only lens we can look at this through. That is the only way we can stop letting shame have any power over us. So where is shame? evident in your life? Are you letting it have more power than it should? You know, every week we do this 2 minutes to think. And so I want to go over the questions and just ask you guys to write down answers to these and reflect on what God's speaking into your heart. Here are the questions. What is an area of your life where shame is shaping your identity and actions? Number 2, who is someone that you can confess that to? And then number 3, how would accepting grace and forgiveness as more powerful than shame change your life? Go ahead and answer those. We'll put 2 minutes up there, and then I'm going to close us in prayer. You guys pray with me. So God, this morning, if we have a true moment of honesty in our hearts, to some level we are dealing with shame. Whether it's shaping our identity or it's just kind of starting in the process. And so I pray first, God, that we would confess that to you. And that we would have enough trust in your grace and forgiveness to confess that to those that we're closest to. To those that we can fully trust, that to those that can be of help to us, to begin to experience healing through all of this. I pray, God, that we would believe that your grace and forgiveness is far greater than sin. That the message of who you are, that in your death and resurrection allows us to see that we too can be resilient. We can experience all the emotions and go through the process, all those things, but we can be overcomers. We can be resilient. We can have courage. We can have strength. We can stand firm. Not because of how great we are, but because of how great you are. So God, my hope is that we will truly trust in that and allow you to transform our hearts and transform our perspective. And in your name we pray. Everybody said, amen. Hey, before you guys get out of here, a couple quick things. If you would like prayer for anything, we've got folks over here to my right, your left, that would love to pray with you about anything that you're going through and would want prayer for. Our partner spotlight for this month is Camp Hope. As we always talk about with generosity here, this is not about building our kingdom, it's about building God's, and your generosity is such a big deal. Camp Hope is our monthly sponsor, and we are working with them. So here's what they do. A lot of you folks work with Camp Hope, but they do an incredible job with camps in Latvia, Costa Rica, and here in Richmond. And then here locally, they do a lot of work with families and with the kids throughout the year. And so if you want to be involved with them and maybe mentor a kid or help at one of the camps, or please go and talk to them, and they'll help you with some further directions on where to go from here. The last thing is this, that in 5 weeks, our share offering is happening. And so if you don't know what our share offering is, here's what we ask folks to do. We ask you to give 1 day's wage, if you can. Do 1 day's wage. And this is above and beyond giving, all right? So this is stretching us, everybody. So if you're a regular giver, you kind of have your normal amount that you would normally give. And what we ask for folks is like, hey, this is above and beyond that to stretch yourself. If you're not a regular giver, this is a great opportunity to kind of engage in this and then become one. But this is like, all right, as we want to go above and beyond, God, we're trusting you're going to go above and beyond. And so we give all the money away of that offering. Last year was about $140,000 we were able to give away to our partners. And so we just write big checks to them. And I want you to just hear, I had a meeting with Heather from Richmond Justice Initiative this week, and we're one of their kind of top donors to them because of your generosity. And just process this. Last year alone, they were able to teach around 8,000 students and bring awareness to human trafficking in these schools. And they're changing the way that like middle schoolers and high schoolers are thinking about everything and able to process what's happening around them so differently. They're literally making like life transformation moments. And so you are a part of that because of your generosity. For Richmond, which is another organization that will support through the share offering, they're on the front lines with the movement towards trying to eradicate essentially the need for foster care here in our city. And they're making all these great movements there, and they're doing some stuff with education as well. And so your generosity helps them continue to do what they're doing, and we get to partner with them on that. And so this is such a big deal, and it makes a massive statement of who we are as a community, and we get to do all of this together. So understand this, like every dollar matters. So we want everyone to participate in this. I said this last week that, we'll have, over the course of these few weeks, probably have, 1,600 active adults in our church, and it's like, man, if everyone just gave, the amount we would be able to do for this is just phenomenal. So it's coming up in 5 weeks. Just wanted to prep you. So on November 24th, I'm like, today's the day of the share offering. You're not like, what? Right? So if you are, I'll be like, you need to come to church more because I've been saying it for the last 5 weeks, right? So no, but so it's coming up in 5 weeks. You guys have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you next week.
What's going on, my boy? It's been a while since the last time we caught up. I see you walking with your head held down. Weight of life has got you showing.